the five. I kept rolling up these lanes, they were fucking loud.
These bitches fuck me cause they know my cutty. I'm smoking dope like a Kid Cudi. I fucked your bitch and I made her get ready. I got rich, yeah.
Part 1. Overture. Welcome to the 80-20 principle. For a very long time, the Pareto law, the 80-20 principle, has lumbered the economic scene like an erratic block on the landscape, an empirical law which nobody can explain. Joseph Steindl. The 80-20 principle can and should be used by every intelligent person in their daily life, by every organization, and by every social grouping and form of society. It helps individuals and groups achieve much more with much less effort. The 80-20 principle can raise personal effectiveness and happiness. It can multiply the profitability of corporations and the effectiveness of any organization. It even holds the key to raising the quality and quantity of public services while cutting their cost. This book, the first ever on the 80-20 principle, is written from a burning conviction, validated in a personal and business experience, that this principle is one of the best ways of dealing with the transcending pressures of modern life. What is the 80-20 principle? The 80-20 principle asserts that a minority of causes, inputs, or effort usually lead to a majority of results, outputs, or rewards. Taken literally, this means that, for example, 80% of what you achieve in your job comes from 20% of the time spent. Thus, for all practical purposes, 4/5 of the effort, a dominant part of it, is largely irrelevant. This is contrary to what people normally expect. So the 80-20 principle states that there is an inbuilt imbalance between the causes and results, inputs and outputs, and effort and reward. A good benchmark for this imbalance is provided by the 80-20 principle. Relationship, the 80-20 relationship. A typical pattern will show that 80% of outputs result from 20% of inputs, that 80% of consequences flow from 20% of causes, or that 80% of results come from 20% of effort. Figure 1 shows these typical patterns. In business, many examples of the 80-20 principle have been validated. 20% of the products usually account for about 80% of the dollar sale value. So do 20% of the customers. 20% of products or customers usually also account for about 80% of an organization's profits. In society, 20% of criminals account for 80% of the value of crime. 20% of motorists cause 80% of accidents. 20% of those who marry comprise 80% of the divorce statistics. Those who consistently remarry and redivorce distort the statistics and give a lopsidedly pessimistic impression of the extent of marital fidelity. 20% of children attain 80% of educational qualifications available. In the home, 20% of your carpets are likely to get 80% of the wear. 20% of your clothes will be worn 80% of the time. And if you have an intruder alarm, 80% of the false alarms will be set off by 20% of the possible causes. The internal combustion engine is a great tribute to the 80-20 principle. 80% of the energy is wasted in combustion, and only 20% gets to the wheels. This 20% of the input generates 100% of the output. Pareto's discovery is systematic and predictable. Lack of imbalance. The pattern underlying the 80-20 principle was discovered in 1897, about 100 years ago, by Italian economist Vilfredo Pareto, 1848 to 1923. That's when he died. His discovery has since been called many names, including the Pareto principle, the Pareto law, the 80-20 rule, the principle of least effort, and the principle of imbalance. Throughout this book, we will call it the 80-20 principle. By the subterranean process of influence on many important achievers, especially business people, computer enthusiasts, and quality engineers, the 80-20 principle has helped to shape the modern world. Yet it has reminded one of the great secrets of our time, and even the select band of cognoscenti who know and use the 80-20 principle only exploit a tiny proportion of its power. So what did Vilfredo Pareto discover? He happened to be looking at patterns of wealth and income in 19th century England. He found that most income and wealth went to a minority of the people in his samples. Perhaps there was nothing very surprising in this, but he also discovered two other facts he thought highly significant. One was that there was a consistent mathematical relationship between the proportion of people as a percentage of total relevant population and the amount of income or wealth that this group enjoyed. To simplify, if 20% of the population enjoyed 80% of the wealth, then you could reliably predict that 10% would have, say, 65% of the wealth, and 5% would have 50% of the wealth. The key point is not the percentages, but the fact that the distribution of wealth across the population was predictably unbalanced. Pareto's other finding, one that really excited him, was that this pattern of imbalance was repeated consistently whenever he looked at data referring to different time periods or different countries. Whether he looked at England in earlier times or whatever data were available from other countries in his own time or earlier, he found the same pattern repeating itself over and over again, with mathematical precision. Was this a freak coincidence or something that had great importance for economics and society? Would it work if applied to sets of data relating to things other than wealth or income? Pareto was a terrific innovator because before him, no one had looked at two related sets of data in this case. The distribution of incomes or wealth compared to the number of income earners or property owners, and compared percentages between the two sets of data. Nowadays, this method is commonplace and has led to major breakthroughs in business and economics. Sadly, although Pareto realized the importance and wide range of his discovery, he was very bad at explaining it. He moved on to a series of fascinating but rambling sociological theories centering on the role of elites, which were hijacked at the end of his life by Mussolini's fascists. The significance of the 80-20 principle lay dormant for a generation. While a few economists, especially in the US, realized its importance, it was not until after the Second World War that two parallel yet completely different pioneers began to make waves with the 80-20 principle. 1949, Zipf's principle of least effort. One of these pioneers was a Harvard professor of philology, George K. Zipf. In 1949, Zipf discovered the principle of least effort, which was actually a rediscovery and elaboration of Pareto's principles. Zipf's principle said that resources, people, goods, time, skills, or anything else that is productive tended to arrange themselves so as to minimize work, so that approximately 20 to 30% of any resource accounted for 70 to 80% of the activity related to that resource. Professor Zipf used population statistics, books, philology, and industrial behavior to show that consistent recurrence of this unbalanced pattern. For example, he analyzed all the Philadelphia mayor's license granted in 1931 in a 20-block area, demonstrating that 70% of marriages occurred between people who lived within 30% of the distance. Incidentally, Zipf also provided a scientific justification for the messy desk by justifying clutter with another law. Frequency of use draws near to us things that are frequently used. Intelligent secretaries have long known that files in frequent use should not be filed. 1951, Duran's rule of vital few and the rise of Japan. The other pioneer of the 80-20 principle is the great quality guru, Romanian-born U.S. engineer Joseph Moses Duran. Born 1904, the man behind the quality revolution of 1950 to 90, he made what he alternatively called the Pareto principle and the rule of vital few, virtually synonymous with the search for high product quality. In 1924, Duran joined the Western Electric, the manufacturing division of Bell Telephone System, starting as a corporate industrial engineer and later setting up as one of the world's first consultants. His great idea was to use the 80-20 principle together with other statistical methods to root out quality faults and improve the reliability and value of the industrial and consumer goods. Duran's path-breaking quality control handbook was first published in 1951 and extolled the 80-20 principle in very broad terms. The economist Pareto found that wealth was not uniformly distributed in the same way as Duran's observations about the quality losses. Many other instances can be found: the distribution of crime amongst criminals, the distribution of accidents among hazardous processes, etc. Pareto's principles of unequal distribution applied to the distribution of wealth and to the distribution of quality losses. No major U.S. industrialist was interested in Duran's theories. In 1953, he was invited to Japan to lecture and met a receptive audience. He stayed on to work with several Japanese corporations, transforming the value of the quality of their consumer goods. It was only once that Japanese threat to U.S. industry had become apparent. After 1970, that Geron was taken seriously in the West, he moved back to do for U.S. industry what he had done for the Japanese. The 80-20 principle was at the heart of his global quality revolution. From the 1960s to the 1990s, progress from using the 80-20 principle. IBM was one of the earliest and most successful corporations to spot and use the 80-20 principle, which helps to explain why most computer systems specialists trained in the 1960s and 1970s are familiar with the idea. In 1963, IBM discovered that about 80% of the computer's time spent is spent executing about 20% of the operating code. The company immediately rewrote its operating software to make the most used 20% very accessible and user-friendly, thus making IBM computers more efficient and faster than competitors' machines for a majority of applications. Those who develop the personal computer and its software in the next generation, such as Apple, Lotus, and Microsoft, apply the 80-20 principle with even more gusto to make their machines cheaper and easier to use for a new generation of customers, including the now celebrated dummies who would previously have given computers a very wide berth. Winner take all. A century after Pareto, the implications of the 80-20 principle have surfaced in the recent controversy over the astronomical and ever-rising incomes going to superstars and those who are very few people at the top of the growing number of professions. Film director Steven Spielberg earned $165 million in 1994. Joseph Jamil, the most highly paid trial lawyer, was paid $90 million. Merely competent film directors or lawyers, of course, earn a tiny fraction of these sums. The 20th century has seen massive efforts to level incomes, but inequality removed in one sphere keeps popping up in another. In the United States, from 1973 to 1995, average real incomes rose by 36%, yet the comparable figure for non-supervisory workers fell by 14%. During the 1980s, all of the gains went to the top 20% of earners, and the mind-boggling 64% of the total increase went to the top 1%. The ownership of shares in the United States is also heavily concentrated with a small minority of households. 5% of the U.S. households own about 75% of the household sector equity. A similar effect may be seen in the role of the dollar. Almost 50% of the world trade is invoiced in dollars, far above America's 13% share of world exports. And while the dollar's share of foreign exchange reserves is 64%, the ratio of American GDP to global output is just over 20%. The 80-20 principle will always reassert itself unless conscious, consistent, and massive efforts are made and sustained to overcome it. Why the 80-20 principle is so important. The reason that the 80-20 principle is so valuable is that it is counterintuitive. We tend to expect that all causes will have roughly the same significance, that all customers are equally valuable, that every bit of business, every product, and every dollar of sales revenue is as good as any other, that all employees in a particular category have roughly equivalent value, that each day or week or year we spend has the same significance, that all our friends have roughly equal value to us, that all inquiries or phones calls should be treated in the same way, that one university is as good as another, that all problems have large number of causes, so that it's not worth isolating a few key causes, that all opportunities are of roughly equal value, so that we treat them all equally. We tend to assume that 50% of the causes or inputs will account for 50% of the results or outputs. There seems to be a natural, almost democratic expectation that causes and results are generally equally balanced, and of course sometimes there are. But this 50-50 fallacy is one of the most inaccurate and harmful, as well as the most deeply rooted of our mental maps. The 80-20 principle asserts that when two sets of data relating to causes and results can be examined and analyzed, the most likely result is that there will be a pattern of imbalance. The imbalance may be 65-35, 70-30, 75-25, 80-20, 95-5, or 99.9 to 0.1, or any set of numbers in between. However, the two numbers in the comparison don't have to add up to 100. See page 24. The 80-20 principle also asserts that when we know the true relationship, we are likely to be surprised at how imbalanced it is. Whatever the actual level of imbalance, it is likely to exceed our prior estimate. Executives may suspect that some customers and some products are more profitable than others, but when the extent of the difference is proved, that they are likely to be surprised and sometimes dumbfounded. Teachers may know that the majority of their disciplinary troubles or most truancy arises from the minority of pupils, but if records are analyzed, the extent to which the imbalance will probably be larger than expected. We may feel that some of our time is more valuable than the rest, but if we measure inputs and outputs, the disparity can still stun us. Why should you care about the 80-20 principle? Whether you realize it or not, the principle applies to your life, to your social world, and to places where you work. Understanding the 80-20 principle gives you great insight into what is really happening in the world around you. The overriding message of this book is that our daily lives can be greatly improved by using the 80-20 principle. Each individual can be more effective and happier. Each profit-seeking corporation can become very much more profitable. Each nonprofit organization can also deliver much more useful outputs. Every government can ensure that its citizens benefit much more from its existence. For everyone and every institution, it is possible to obtain much more than is of value and avoid what has negative value with much less input of effort, expense, or investment. At the heart of this progress, is a process of substitution. Resources that have weak effects in any particular use are not used, or are used sparingly. Resources that have powerful effects are used as much as possible. Every resource is ideally used where it has the greatest value. Wherever possible, weak resources are developed so that they can mimic the behavior of the stronger resources. Business and markets have used this process to create effect for hundreds of years. The French economist J.B. Say coined the word entrepreneur, 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 around 1800, saying that the entrepreneur shifts economic resources out of an area of lower productivity into an area of higher productivity and yield. But one fascinating implication of the 80-20 principle is how far businesses and markets will still are from producing optimal solutions. For example, the 80-20 principle asserts that 20% of the products or customers or employees are really responsible for about 80% of profits. If this is true and detailed, investigations usually confirm that some such very imbalanced patterns exist. The state of affairs implied is very far from being efficient or optimal. The implications that 80% of products or customers or employees are only contributing 20% of profits, that there's a great waste, that the most powerful resources of the company are being held back by a majority of much less effective resources, that profits could be multiplied if more of the best sort of products could be sold, employees hired, or customers attracted, or convinced to buy more from the firm. In this kind of situation, one might well ask, why continue to make the 80% of products that only generate 20% of profits? Companies rarely ask these questions, perhaps because the answer that would mean very radical action. To stop doing 4/5 of what you are doing is not a trivial change. What J.B. Say called the work of entrepreneurs, modern financiers call arbitrage. International financial markets are very quick to correct anomalies in valuation. For example, between exchange rates, but business organizations and individuals are generally very poor at this sort of entrepreneurship or arbitrage, at shifting resources from where they have weak results to where they have powerful results, or at cutting off low-value resources and buying more high-value resources. Most of the time, we do not realize that the extent in which some resources, but only a small minority, are super productive. What Joseph Giron called the vital few, while the majority, the trivial many, exhibit little productivity or else actually have negative value. If we did realize the difference between the vital few and the trivial many in all aspects of our lives, and if we did something about it, we could multiply anything that we valued. The 80-20 principle and the chaos theory. Probability theory tells us that it's virtually impossible for all applications of the 80-20 principle to occur randomly as a freak of chance. We can only explain the principle by posting some deeper meaning or cause that lurks behind it. Pareto himself grappled with this issue, trying to apply consistent methodology to the study of society. He searched for theories that picture facts of experience and observation, for regular patterns, social laws, or uniformities that explain the behavior of individuals in society. Pareto's sociology failed to find the persuasive key. He died long before the emergence of chaos theory, which has great parallels with the 80-20 principle and helps to explain it. The last third of the 20th century has seen a revolution in the way scientists think about the universe, overturning the prevailing wisdom of the past 350 years. That prevailing wisdom was a machine-based and rational view, which itself was a great advance on the mystical and random view of the world held in the Middle Ages. The machine-based view converted God from being an irrational and unpredictable force into a more user-friendly clockmaker engineer. The view of the world held from the 17th century and so prevalent today, except in the advanced scientific circles, was immensely comforting and useful. All phenomena were reduced to regular, predictable linear relationships. For example, A causes B, B causes C, and A plus C causes D. The worldview enabled any individual part of the universe, the operation of the human heart, for example, or of any individual market, to be analyzed separately, because the whole was the sum of the parts and vice versa. But in the second half of the 20th century, it seems much more accurate to view the world as an evolving organism where the whole system is more than the sum of its parts, and where the relationships between the parts are nonlinear. Causes are difficult to pin down. There are complex interdependencies between causes and effects are blurred. The snag with linear thinking is that it doesn't always work. It is an oversimplification of reality. Equilibrium is illusory, or fleeting. The universe is wonky. Yet chaos theory, despite its name, does not say that everything is a hopeless and incomprehensible mess. Rather, there is a self-organizing logic lurking behind the disorder, a predictable linearity, something which economist Paul Krugman has called spooky, eerie, and terrifyingly exact. The logic is more difficult to describe than to detect, and is not totally dissimilar to the recurrence of a theme in a piece of music. Certain characteristic patterns recur, but with infinite and unpredictable variety. Chaos theory and the 80-20 principle illuminate each other. What have chaos theory and related scientific concepts got to do with the 80-20 principle? Although no one else appears to have made the link, I think the answer is a great deal. The principle of imbalance. The common thread between chaos theory and the 80-20 principle is the issue of balance, or more precisely, imbalance. Both chaos theory and the 80-20 principle assert with a great deal of empirical backing that the universe is unbalanced. They both say the world is not linear, cause and effect are rarely linked in an equal way. Both also place great store by self-organization. Some forces are always more forceful than others and will try to grab more than their fair share of resources. Chaos theory helps to explain why and how this imbalance happens by tracing a number of developments over time. The universe is not a straight line. The 80-20 principle, like the chaos theory, is based around the idea of nonlinearity. A great deal of what happens is unimportant and can be disregarded. Yet there are always a few forces that have an influence way beyond their numbers. These are the forces that must be identified and watched. If they are forces for good, we should multiply them. If they are forces we don't like, we need to think very carefully about how to neutralize them. The 80-20 principle supplies a very powerful empirical test of nonlinearity in any system. We can ask, do 20% of causes lead to 80% of results? Is 80% of any phenomenon associated with only 20% of the related phenomenon? This is a useful method to flush out nonlinearity, but it's even more useful because it directs us to identifying the unusually powerful forces at work. Feedback loops distort and disturb balance. The 80-20 principle is also consistent with and can be explained by reference to the feedback loops identified by chaos theory, whereby small initial influences can become greatly multiplied and produce highly unexpected results, which nevertheless can be explained in retrospect. In the absence of feedback loops, the natural distribution of phenomena would be 50-50. Inputs of given frequency would lead to commensurate results. It is only because of positive and negative feedback loops that causes do not have equal results. Yet it also seems to be true and powerful. Positive feedback loops only affect a small minority of the inputs. This helps to explain why those small minority of inputs can exert so much influence. We can see positive feedback loops operating in many areas, explaining how it is that we typically end up with the 80-20 rather than 50-50 relationships between populations. For example, the rich get richer, not just or mainly because of superior abilities, but because baguette riches, riches beget riches. A similar phenomenon exists with goldfish in a pond. Even if you start with a goldfish almost exactly the same size, those that are slightly bigger become very much bigger because even with only slight initial advantages and stronger propulsion in larger mouths, they're able to capture and gobble up disproportionate amounts of food. The tipping point. Related to the idea of feedback loops is the concept of the tipping point. Up to a certain point, a new force, whether it is a new product, a disease, a new rock group, or a new social habit such as jogging or rollerblading, finds it difficult to make headway. A great deal of effort generates little by way of results. At this point, many pioneers give up, but if the new force persists and can cross a certain invisible line, a small amount of additional effort can reap huge returns. This invisible line is the tipping point. The concept comes from the principles of the epidemic theory. The tipping point is the point at which an ordinary and stable phenomenon, a low-level flu outbreak, can turn into a public health crisis because of the number of people who are infected and can therefore infect others. And since the behavior of epidemics is nonlinear and they don't behave in a way we expect, small changes like bringing new infections down to 30,000 from 40,000 can have huge effects. It all depends when and how the changes are made. First come, best served. Chaos theory advocates sensitive dependence on initial conditions. What happens first, even something ostensibly trivial, can have a disproportionate effect. This resonates with and helps to explain the 80-20 principle. The latter states that a minority of causes exert a majority of effects. One limitation of the 80-20 principle, taken in isolation, is that it always represents a snapshot of what is true now, or more precisely, in the very recent past when the snapshot was taken. This is where chaos theory's doctrine of sensitive dependence on initial conditions is helpful. A small lead early on can turn into a larger lead or a dominant position later on, until equilibrium is disturbed and another small force then exerts a disproportionate influence. A firm that, in the early stage of the market, provides the product that is 10% better than its rivals may end up with 100 or 200% greater market share. Even if rivals later provide a better product in the early days of motoring, if 51% of drivers or countries decide to drive on the right rather than the left side of the road, this will tend to become the norm for nearly 100% of road users. In the early days of using a circular clock, if 51% of clocks go what we now call clockwise rather than counterclockwise, this convention will become dominant. Although clocks could just as logically have moved to left, in fact the clock over Florence Cathedral moves counterclockwise and shows 24 hours. Soon after 1442, when the cathedral was built, the authorities and clockmakers standardized on a 12-hour clockwise clock. Because the majority of clocks had those features, yet if 51% of clocks had ever been like the clock over Florence Cathedral, we would now be reading 24-hour clock backwards. These observations regarding sensitive dependence on initial conditions do not exactly illustrate the 80-20 principles. The examples given involve change over time, whereas the 80-20 principle involves a static breakdown of causes at any one time. Yet there is an important link between the two. Both phenomena help to show the universe abhors balance. In the former case, we see a natural flight away from a 50-50 split of competing phenomena. A 51-49 split is inherently unstable and tends to gravitate towards a 95-5, 99-1, or even a 100-0 split. Equality ends in dominance. That is one of the messages of chaos theory. The 80-20 principle's message is different yet complementary. It tells us that at any one point, a majority of any phenomena will be explained or caused by a minority of the actors participating in the phenomenon. 80% of the results come from 20% of the causes. A few things are important. Most are not. The 80-20 principle sorts good movies from bad. One of the most dramatic examples of the 80-20 principle at work is with movies. Two economists have just made a study of revenues and lifespans of 300 movies released over an 18-month period. They found that 4 movies, just 1.3% of the total, earned 80% of box office revenues. The other 296 movies, or 98.7%, earned only 20% of that gross. So movies, which are a good example of unrestricted markets at work, produce virtually an 81 rule, a very clear demonstration of the principle of imbalance. Even more intriguing is why. It transpires that moviegoers behave just like gas particles in random motion. As identified by the chaos theory, gas particles, ping pong balls, or moviegoers all behave at random, but produce a particularly unbalanced result. Word of mouth from reviews in the first audiences determines whether the second set of audiences will be large or small, which determines the next set, and so on. Movies like Independence Day or Mission Impossible continue to play to packed houses, while other star-studded and expensive movies like Waterworld or Daylight very quickly play to smaller and smaller houses, and then none at all. This is the 80-20 principle working with a vengeance. A guide to this guidebook. Chapter 2 explains how you can put the 80-20 principle into practice and explores the distinction between the 80-20 analysis and 80-20 thinking, both of which are useful methods derived from the 80-20 principle. 80-20 analysis is a systematic, quantitative method of comparing cause and effects. 80-20 thinking is a broader, less precise, and more intuitive procedure comprising the mental models and habits that enable us to hypothesize what are the important causes of anything important in our lives, to identify these causes, and to make sharp improvements in our position by redeploying our resources accordingly. Part 2, Corporate Success Needn't Be a Mystery, summarizes the most powerful business uses of the 80-20 principle. These uses have been tried and tested and found to be of immense value, yet remain curiously unexploited by most of the business community. There is little in my summary that is original, but anyone seeking major profit improvement, whether from a small or large business, should find this a very useful primer and the first ever to appear in a book. Part 3, Work Less, Earn, and Enjoy More shows how the 80-20 principle can be used to raise the level at which you are operating in both your work and your personal life. This is a pioneering attempt to apply the 80-20 principle on a novel canvas. And the attempt, although I'm sure it is imperfect and incomplete in many ways, does lead to some surprising insights. For example, 80% of the typical person's happiness or achievement in life occurs in a small proportion of that life. The peaks of the greatest personal value can usually be greatly expanded. The common view is that we are short of time. My application of the 80-20 principle suggests the reverse, that we are actually awash with time and profligate in its abuse. Part 4. Crescendo, progress, regain draws the themes together and positions the 80-20 principle as the greatest secret engine of progress available to us all. It hints at the uses that could be made of the 80-20 principle for the public good as well as for corporate wealth creation and personal advancement. Why the 80-20 principle brings good news. I want to end this introduction on a personal rather than a procedural note. I believe that the 80-20 principle is enormously hopeful. Certainly, the principle brings home what may be evident anyway, that there is a tragic amount of waste everywhere in the way that nature operates, in business, in society, in our own lives. If the typical pattern is for 80% of results to come from 20% of inputs, it is necessarily typical too that 80%, the great majority of inputs, are having only a marginal 20% impact. The paradox is that such waste can be wonderful news if we can use the 80-20 principle creatively, not just to identify and castigate low productivity, but to do something positive about it. There is enormous scope for improvement by rearranging and redirecting both nature and our own lives, improving on nature, refusing to accept the status quo, and the root of all progress, evolutionary, scientific, social, and personal. George Bernard Shaw put it well. The reasonable man adapts himself to the world. The unreasonable one persists in trying to adapt the world to himself. Therefore, all progress depends on the unreasonable man. The implication of the 80-20 principle is that output can be not just increased by multiplied, but multiplied. If we can make the low productivity inputs nearly as productive as the high productivity inputs, successful experiments with the 80-20 principle in the business arena suggests that with creativity and determination, this leap in value can usually be made. There are two routes to achieving this. One is to reallocate the resources from unproductive to productive uses, the secret of all entrepreneurs down the ages. Find a round hole for a round peg, a square hole for a square peg, and a perfect fit for any shape in the between. Experience suggests that every resource has its ideal arena, where the resource can be tens or hundreds of times more effective than in most other arenas. The other route to progress the method of scientists, doctors, preachers, computer system designers, educationalists, and trainers is to find ways to make unproductive resources more effective even in their existing applications, to make the weak resources behave as though they were their more productive cousins, to mimic, if necessary, by intricate rote learning procedures, the highly productive resources. The few things that work fantastically well should be identified, cultivated, nurtured, and multiplied. At the same time, the waste of the majority of things that will always prove to be of low value to man and beast should be abandoned or severely cut back. As I have been writing this book and observed thousands of examples of the 80-20 principle, I've had my faith reinforced, faith in progress and great leaps forward, and in mankind's ability, individually and collectively, to improve the hand that nature has dealt. Joseph Ford comments, God plays dice with the universe, but they're loaded dice. And the main objective is to find out by what rules they were loaded and how we can use them for our own ends. The 80-20 principle can help us achieve precisely that.